Emma had always loved her job as a flight attendant. The constant movement, the changing faces, the thrill of being in the air. It was a career that had given her a sense of purpose. She had spent years perfecting the art of keeping passengers comfortable, managing unpredictable situations, and handling the occasional difficult traveler with grace. She wasn't just good at what she did, she was great. That morning, she had gone through her usual routine without a second thought. The pre-flight briefing, the safety checks, the friendly smiles exchanged with fellow crew members, it was all second nature to her by now. She had done this thousands of times before. The flight from New York to Miami was supposed to be just another uneventful journey. One she had completed dozens of times without incident. As the plane lifted off the ground, Emma felt that familiar rush. The brief moment of weightlessness that always reminded her why she had chosen this career in the first place. She moved down the aisle with practiced ease, checking on passengers, offering smiles, and distributing drinks with a warmth that made her a favorite among frequent travelers. The air inside the cabin was calm, a peaceful hum of conversation and quiet distractions. Some passengers scrolled through their phones, others watched in-flight movies, and a few simply stared out the window, lost in their own thoughts. Then, in the middle of her usual rounds, she heard it, a voice, not overly loud, but distinct enough to cut through the quiet murmur of the cabin. The words were unmistakable. "The country is a mess under the new president." Emma turned her head slightly, her trained ears picking up the conversation despite the controlled noise of the plane. She immediately recognized the speaker. Donald Trump. She hadn't realized he was on board. He was seated a few rows ahead, surrounded by a small entourage, his presence commanding the space around him without effort. He wasn't shouting, he wasn't making a spectacle, but his words carried in the air like a sudden gust of wind. Sharp and impossible to ignore. Emma wasn't particularly political. She had never been one to get into debates or voice strong opinions about the state of the world. But something about hearing those words, spoken so casually, hit a nerve. Maybe it was the exhaustion from a long week, the stress of handling difficult passengers, or the mounting frustrations she hadn't even realized she was carrying. Maybe it was something deeper, an irritation she had never acknowledged until now. Without thinking, before she could stop herself, the words tumbled out under her breath. "At least things weren't a disaster under my president." It wasn't loud. It wasn't meant for anyone but herself. A fleeting thought that had slipped past the filter she usually kept so tightly in place. But the moment the words left her lips, she knew she had made a mistake. A silence spread around her like ripples in water. The air, which had felt so routine and easy just moments ago, suddenly felt thick, charged with something unspoken but powerful. The flight attendants near her froze in place. A few passengers glanced up, their eyes flickering between Emma and the row where Trump sat. And then, he turned. Slowly, deliberately, Trump shifted in his seat, his gaze locking onto Emma's like a laser. Her breath hitched. In all her years as a flight attendant, she had dealt with irate passengers, rude customers, and people who had far too much to drink. But this was different. This was a man who thrived on control, on perception, on power. And Emma, a simple flight attendant who had let her emotions slip for just a second, had just made herself the focus of his attention. Her heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing through every possible outcome. Would he lash out? Would he say something sharp, cutting her down in front of everyone? Would he demand she be removed mid-flight? But Trump didn't speak. He didn't need to. His expression was unreadable, but the weight of his stare said more than words ever could. There was a coldness in his eyes, a silent promise that this wasn't over. Then, just as quickly as he had turned to look at her, he shifted back around, facing forward as if she didn't exist. Emma exhaled shakily, realizing only then that she had been holding her breath. She forced herself to move, to continue down the aisle as if nothing had happened. But her hands trembled as she adjusted a tray. She tried to focus, to return to the rhythm of her duties. But the unease coiled in her stomach like a snake. She could feel the glances from other passengers, the tension lingering in the air like an unspoken secret. Her fellow flight attendants wouldn't meet her eyes. It was a single comment, one slip of the tongue. But Emma knew, deep in her gut, that it had changed everything. The flight continued, but for her, it felt like a slow descent into something unknown, something inevitable, The seconds ticked by like a countdown she couldn't stop. She had spent her career building a reputation for professionalism, for grace under pressure. And now? Now she had no idea what was coming next. Her supervisor appeared at the front of the cabin, his face unreadable. The moment their eyes met, Emma's stomach dropped. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. She had made a mistake. A careless, impulsive mistake. And now, she had to face the consequences. The air inside the plane, once comfortable and familiar, felt suffocating. The hum of conversation around her seemed distant, irrelevant. Her thoughts raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. Would she get a warning? A reprimand? Would it blow over? But as Paul, her supervisor, walked toward her with slow, measured steps, Emma knew she wasn't getting a warning. This was something far worse. Her career, the life she had spent years building, was about to come crashing down. And there was absolutely nothing she could do to stop it. Emma's hands felt cold, her pulse pounding in her ears as she struggled to maintain her composure. The cabin was still, eerily still, as if the entire plane was holding its breath. She had made a mistake, a single, thoughtless comment whispered under her breath, but now, it hung in the air like a curse. The glances, the uneasy shifting of passengers, the way her fellow flight attendants moved just a little bit further away from her, it all told her what she already knew. She had crossed a line. The silence around her wasn't the kind that passed unnoticed. It was calculated, waiting, charged, the kind of silence before a storm. And then, from the front of the cabin, she saw him, Paul, her supervisor. His face was unreadable, but Emma had known him long enough to recognize when he was serious. And this was more than serious. This was final. Paul was a man of discipline, the kind of leader who never let emotion dictate his actions. He was fair, strict when needed, but he never raised his voice. He didn't have to. When he spoke, people listened, and right now, Emma could tell that whatever he was about to say would change everything. She swallowed hard, her throat dry as sandpaper. As Paul walked down the aisle toward her with slow, deliberate steps, each one felt like the ticking of a clock, counting down to her fate. Emma turned slightly, hoping, praying, that maybe this wasn't about her. Maybe she could pretend that the last few minutes hadn't happened. Maybe if she just kept moving, if she just kept doing her job, it would all pass. But Paul's eyes didn't waver. They were locked on her. A wave of nausea washed over her as he stopped directly in front of her. The passengers closest to them had gone quiet, pretending to mind their own business but clearly listening, waiting. The entire plane had become a courtroom, and she was standing trial. Emma, Paul said, his voice low and steady. Come with me. It wasn't a request. Her stomach dropped. For a split second, she wanted to argue, to ask why, but she already knew. There was no use in fighting it. Not now. Not when every eye on the plane was watching her. She nodded, her breath coming in shallow, shaky bursts. With every step she took toward the front of the cabin, she felt smaller, as if she was shrinking under the weight of her own mistake. The usual comfort of the narrow aisles, the soft hum of the plane, the passengers who had always blended into the background of her job, all of it felt foreign now. Like she didn't belong here anymore. The whispers started almost immediately. Is that the flight attendant who? Did she really say something to him? Is she getting fired? Right here? Mid-flight? Emma's skin burned, embarrassment crawling up her neck like fire. She clenched her fists, forcing herself to keep walking, keep breathing, keep pretending that she had control. She reached the galley at the front of the plane. It was a small space, tucked away from most of the passengers, but not far enough that they wouldn't notice what was happening. Paul turned to face her, arms crossed. He wasn't angry, he wasn't yelling, but that was so much worse. Because Paul wasn't the kind of person who wasted energy on people who didn't matter. And right now, he was looking at her like she no longer mattered. Emma, he said, his tone firm but measured. You know why I pulled you aside. She opened her mouth to respond, but her voice caught in her throat. It was just, she started. But the words crumbled before they could even take form. What was she supposed to say? That it was nothing? That it wasn't that bad? That she hadn't meant for anyone to hear? Paul's expression remained impassive, unreadable. You crossed a line, he said simply. The finality of those words hit her harder than she expected. I wasn't trying to. It doesn't matter. He cut her off. And the sheer weight of those words shattered any lingering hope she had of defending herself. Emma felt herself trembling. Her heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear anything else. "You understand what happens next?" Paul continued. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. A sentence. And suddenly, Emma realized there was no salvaging this. Not with an apology. Not with an explanation. Not with anything. She had already lost. "We'll be landing soon," Paul said, glancing at his watch. "You won't be continuing with this flight after that. You won't be working another one. Either. I'm sorry. But this is where it ends." Emma sucked in a sharp breath. Her body going rigid. Fired. She was being fired. Mid-flight. In front of everyone. Her legs felt weak beneath her. Like they might give out at any moment. This couldn't be happening. But it was happening. Her mouth went dry. "Paul, please, Paul shook his head. "It's done, Emma." Those 3 words were the heaviest words she had ever heard. Done. Finished. Over. She barely heard him when he continued. "When we land, you'll disembark before the passengers. Security will escort you out of the airport. We'll handle your belongings." The lump in her throat made it impossible to breathe. She wanted to beg. She wanted to cry. But the reality of it all was too big. Too crushing. Her career, her life, had just been erased in the span of a single conversation. Paul exhaled, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "I'm sorry, Emma, but there's no coming back from this." For a second, she felt like she was outside of her own body, watching herself from a distance. The flight attendants she had worked with for years wouldn't meet her eyes. The passengers would all talk about this for days, weeks, maybe forever. She would be a cautionary tale. A name whispered in training sessions. A story shared among new hires. "Did you hear about that flight attendant who got fired because of a comment?" "Yeah, mid-flight." Imagine how humiliating that must have been. Emma forced herself to nod. Because what else could she do? The worst moment of her life had already happened. Now, she just had to survive the landing. And somehow, some way, she had to figure out what came next. Because this was just the beginning of her fall. And the ground was rushing up fast. Emma could still feel the heat rising in her cheeks as Paul's words echoed in her ears. "It's done, Emma." The moment should have felt surreal. Like something happening to someone else. A nightmare she would wake up from. But the reality was sharp. Slicing through her like ice. Her career, her reputation, her entire life as a flight attendant, it was slipping through her fingers. And there was nothing she could do to stop it. She nodded numbly, her throat too tight to respond. The last thing she wanted was to cry in front of him. In front of everyone. But the weight of it, the sheer finality, was pressing against her chest like a heavy stone. Paul glanced at the other crew members, who stood awkwardly nearby, pretending not to listen. Emma caught a glimpse of Olivia, a junior flight attendant she had trained just a year ago. Olivia's eyes were wide, uncertain, filled with an unspoken question. Is this really happening? Yes, it was. Paul shifted his weight and spoke again, his voice quieter but no less authoritative. I need you to return to your seat. Emma, when we land, you'll exit before the passengers. His words might as well have been a branding iron against her skin. He wasn't just firing her. He was making it public. She clenched her jaw, swallowing back the humiliation that threatened to choke her. I understand, she said, barely recognizing her own voice. It sounded small, distant. Paul gave her a curt nod before turning away, already moving on, as if she were nothing more than another problem checked off his list. Emma turned, feeling every pair of eyes on her as she walked back toward the rear of the cabin. The aisle, which had always felt like second nature to her, now felt impossibly long. Her legs felt stiff, her hands trembling at her sides. Passengers were watching. Of course they were watching. A man in business attire, row 14, gave her a sympathetic look. Like he pitied her. Another woman, row 16, whispered something to the person next to her. Eyes darting toward Emma before quickly looking away. But the worst part? The worst part was hearing her own name. She's the one, right? The flight attendant who said something to Trump? Yeah, I heard she's getting fired. Mid-flight. Can you believe that? Emma forced herself to keep walking. To not react. She could feel the heat of shame creeping up her neck. Her hands balling into fists. She had handled drunk passengers, entitled VIPs, screaming babies, but nothing had ever made her feel this powerless before. By the time she reached the galley at the back of the plane, her body felt like it was made of lead. She leaned against the counter, her breath coming in shallow bursts. She wanted to run. She wanted to disappear. But there was nowhere to go. The intercom chimed, and the captain's voice filled the cabin, announcing the plane's descent. Emma squeezed her eyes shut. This is it. The worst part was still coming. The flight attendants began their final checks, moving through the cabin, securing trays, ensuring seat belts were fastened. Emma, however, was no longer one of them. She was just waiting, trapped in a limbo she couldn't escape. A few moments later, Olivia walked up beside her. She hesitated before speaking. Emma? Her voice was barely above a whisper. Uncertain, Emma turned, forcing herself to smile. A weak, hollow attempt. It's okay, she said, even though nothing was okay. Olivia bit her lip, looking like she wanted to say something else. But before she could, Paul's voice came over the crew's intercom. Final approach. Everyone in position. Emma's stomach twisted. She didn't have a position anymore. She wasn't part of this team anymore. She made her way to an empty seat in the back row, where crew members sometimes sat when they weren't needed in the aisle. Except this time, she wasn't resting, she was waiting for exile. The descent was smooth, but to Emma, it felt like her entire world was plummeting. She thought about the passengers, how they would all watch her leave. She thought about her family, how she would have to tell them she lost her job like this. She thought about her future, how she didn't have one anymore. The wheels touched down with a soft jolt, and the cabin filled with the familiar sounds of landing, seat belts clicking open, the rustling of passengers grabbing their bags, the low murmur of conversations. Then Paul's voice, calm and authoritative as ever. Emma, it's time. She took a deep breath and stood. Her legs felt unsteady, her body weak, but she forced herself to move. The other flight attendants avoided her gaze, not because they were cruel, but because they didn't know what to say. She walked toward the front of the plane, her face blank, her shoulders squared. If she was going to be humiliated, she wouldn't let them see her break. The passengers watched her as she passed. Some whispered, some avoided eye contact, some stared openly, eager for the gossip they would tell their friends. And then, as she reached the front, she saw him. Trump. He was still seated, his expression unreadable. He didn't speak, didn't react. He simply watched her. Emma forced herself to look away. She stepped through the exit, feeling the cold rush of airport air hit her face. The flight was over. Her career was over. And as she walked into the terminal, alone, she realized she had no idea what came next. Emma stood frozen in the middle of the airport terminal, her body rigid, her mind trapped in a relentless cycle of disbelief. It felt like she was underwater. Every sound muffled, every movement sluggish, the weight of her own actions pressed against her chest. A crushing, inescapable force. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. Just hours ago, she was standing in that very same terminal, greeting passengers with a practiced smile, feeling the usual sense of anticipation before a flight. She had performed her duties just as she always had, helping families with their luggage, chatting politely with elderly travelers, ensuring that nervous flyers felt at ease. She had been Emma, the flight attendant who had given years of her life to this job. And now? Now, she was Emma, the woman who had been fired mid-flight. The humiliation of it burned through her like wildfire. A single mistake, one impulsive comment, and it had cost her everything. Emma pulled out her phone, staring at the blank screen. No notifications, no missed calls, no texts. She should call someone, her mom, a friend, anyone, but what would she even say? Hey, I just got fired in front of a plane full of people. Can you believe that? Her stomach twisted at the thought. Her hands trembled as she shoved the phone back into her pocket. Her breath shaky. The reality of what had happened was finally settling in, thick and suffocating. It wasn't just about losing the job. It wasn't just about being fired. It was the way it had happened. The way the world had watched. Passengers had whispered about her. Colleagues had looked at her with pity or worse, disappointment. And Trump? He hadn't even needed to say a word. His silence had been enough. Emma squeezed her eyes shut, replaying the moment over and over again. She had been standing in the aisle, serving drinks, feeling nothing out of the ordinary. The flight had been smooth, uneventful, and then she heard him. The country is a mess under the new president. It was a simple statement, One she had probably heard 100 times before. But for some reason, this time was different. She had reacted. She had spoken. At least things weren't a disaster under my president. The words had left her lips before she even processed them. A flicker of frustration. A brief lapse in control. And in that moment, everything had changed. She remembered the way the air had shifted. The way the cabin had gone eerily still. She remembered his eyes locking onto hers. Sharp and calculating. She remembered the way Paul, her supervisor, had called her aside, his voice cold and detached, delivering the final blow. "You're done, Emma. We can't keep you on after this." She could still hear those words in her head, over and over, like a broken record. She had wanted to take them back. She had wanted to scream that it was a mistake, that she hadn't meant anything by it, that she wasn't even particularly political, that it had just been a reaction. A slip of the tongue. But it didn't matter. It was too late. And now, standing in the middle of the terminal, alone, she felt the weight of it all. Passengers from her flight were still here, walking past her, their voices hushed, their glances quick but curious. She knew what they were thinking. That's her, the flight attendant who got fired. What was she thinking? Her throat tightened. She wanted to disappear, to sink into the floor, to erase herself from this moment, this reality. Instead, she forced herself to move. Step, breathe, step, breathe. She walked toward an empty row of chairs near a large window overlooking the runway. Planes were taking off, their bright lights flashing against the darkening sky. Just hours ago, that had been her world. Now, she was nothing more than an outsider, a spectator. Emma sat down, gripping the edge of her seat, her hands clammy and weak. For the first time since it happened, tears pricked her eyes. She had worked so hard for this job. She had sacrificed so much. The sleepless nights, the exhaustion, the constant movement, the missed birthdays and holidays, all for what? For it to end like this? A mistake, a moment of frustration, a comment that she hadn't even meant to say out loud. The regret sank in deeper, twisting in her gut like a knife. Why did I say it? It was the only thought running through her mind, over and over. Why couldn't I have just kept my mouth shut? A small part of her knew the answer. Because she had been tired. Because she had been frustrated. Because she had let her guard slip for just 1 second. And now, she was paying the price. Emma felt her phone buzz in her pocket. She pulled it out, her hands still shaking. It was a text from her mom. "Are you okay?" Emma stared at the screen, her vision blurring. No, she wasn't okay. She was the farthest thing from okay she had ever been. But what was she supposed to say? Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, uncertainty gnawing at her. Finally, she typed, "I messed up, Mom. I lost my job." She hit send before she could second-guess herself. A few seconds later, another message appeared. "Come home. We'll figure this out together." Emma inhaled sharply, a single tear slipping down her cheek. Home. That was something, at least. She wasn't sure what came next. She wasn't sure how she would rebuild her life, how she would move forward from this. But one thing was clear. She couldn't sit in this airport forever. She had to stand up. She had to keep going, even if she didn't know where she was headed. And if you believe that one mistake doesn't define a person, if you know what it feels like to struggle, to lose something, to hit rock bottom, then show Emma your support. Like, comment, share, because everyone deserves a second chance. Emma walked out of the airport, the cool night air hitting her like a slap to the face. The hum of the city buzzed around her, cars honking, conversations blending into a distant murmur, neon signs flashing along the streets, but she felt detached from it all. As if she were a ghost drifting through the chaos. She had spent years moving through airports, greeting passengers, offering warm smiles even on her worst days. The terminals had always been familiar, a second home, but tonight, as she stepped onto the curb outside, she had never felt more lost. No uniform, no crew, no purpose. For the first time in her adult life, she had nowhere to go. Her fingers curled into fists, nails pressing into her palms as she stared at the street ahead. She didn't even know why she had walked outside. She had no plan, no next step. Her mind was an empty void, swallowed by one overwhelming, unshakable truth. She had lost everything. The buzzing of her phone in her pocket jolted her out of her thoughts. She hesitated. Was it her mother again? A friend? One of her colleagues? Checking in out of guilt or morbid curiosity? She wasn't ready. She couldn't face the pity. The "Are you okay?" messages? The hushed whispers about what happened to Emma. She pulled out her phone and stared at the screen. 10 missed calls. Her stomach clenched. She scrolled through them. Mom, 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 Emily. Mom again. Another friend. And then, her heart skipped. Paul. Her supervisor. Emma's breath hitched. She almost dropped the phone right there on the pavement. Why would he be calling her now? A spark of irrational hope flared in her chest. Maybe it had all been a mistake. Maybe they had overreacted, and he was calling to say they had reconsidered. Maybe she would still have her job. Her thumb hovered over the screen. She took a deep breath. And then, before she could stop herself, she pressed play on the voicemail. Paul's voice came through, steady and impersonal. Emma, I wanted to reach out before you hear it from someone else. HR is finalizing the termination paperwork. You'll receive a formal notice soon. We'll arrange for your final paycheck. If you need to collect any belongings from the employee lockers, you'll need to do it by the end of the week. Security will be there to escort you. I know this is difficult, but this is company policy. Take care of yourself. The message ended. Emma's chest tightened. No apology. No explanation. No second chances. Just policy. The last shred of hope she had been clinging to disintegrated. She felt her throat close up, her fingers tightening around the phone until her knuckles turned white. It was over. Really, truly, irreversibly over. A dry, bitter laugh escaped her lips before she could stop it. Security. Escort. Like she was some kind of criminal. A lump formed in her throat. She squeezed her eyes shut, forcing the tears back. She wouldn't break down here, on this curb, in front of a world that had already decided she wasn't worth saving. She had spent so many years pouring everything she had into this job. She had worked holidays, missed birthdays, sacrificed sleep and stability, all because she had loved it. And now, all it had taken was one mistake. One comment for them to erase her like she had never existed. Her phone buzzed again. A text from Emily. I heard. I don't even know what to say. But I'm here if you need me. Emma swallowed hard. She didn't know what to say either. What could she say? That she was ashamed? That she felt worthless? That the regret sat in her chest like a stone, making it impossible to breathe? She started typing, then deleted the message. Started again, deleted it again. In the end, she just sent 3 words. I feel lost. Emily responded almost immediately. You're not lost. You just need time to figure things out. And you don't have to do it alone. Emma stared at the words, her vision blurring. She wanted to believe that. She wanted to believe that this wasn't the end. That she wasn't irreparably broken. That she could rebuild herself. But right now, all she felt was the crushing weight of isolation. She wasn't just unemployed, she was forgotten. The passengers had moved on. The crew had moved on. Even the company had moved on. And she was stuck here, standing on a street that didn't feel like hers anymore. Her hands shook as she stuffed her phone back into her pocket and wrapped her arms around herself. The night air suddenly too cold, too sharp. She thought about calling a cab, going somewhere. But where? A hotel? Back home to her mother. Where she would have to face the disappointment in her voice, the worry in her eyes? She wasn't ready. She wasn't ready for any of it. So instead, she walked. Her feet carried her forward, away from the airport, into the unfamiliar city. The streetlights cast long shadows, the neon signs flickering, but none of it felt real. She didn't know where she was going. She just knew she couldn't stay here. She passed people on the sidewalk, couples laughing, friends chatting, business travelers with rolling suitcases hurrying past her. No one noticed her. No one knew that just hours ago, she had been someone else. And now? She was just a woman who had lost everything. Emma kept walking, her mind clouded, her chest tight. She didn't want to feel this way forever. She wanted to believe that this moment, this unbearable, suffocating emptiness, wasn't permanent. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't. Maybe there was something waiting for her at the end of this road. Maybe she would find a new path, a new purpose. But for now, she just kept moving, one step at a time. And if you've ever felt like Emma, lost, alone, unsure of what comes next, leave a comment below. Let her know she's not the only one. Because no one should have to go through this alone. Emma sat on a weathered bench outside the airport, the cold metal biting through her thin uniform. Her hands trembled in her lap, fingers clutching her phone like it was the only thing tethering her to reality. The screen was still illuminated with the last text from her best friend. Emily, you're not lost. You just need time to figure things out. And you don't have to do it alone. Emma exhaled sharply, her breath visible in the night air. Alone. That was exactly how she felt. Like the world had carried on without her, leaving her stranded in a moment she couldn't escape. The buzzing of her phone startled her, the vibration rattling against her palm. She stared at the name flashing across the screen. Mom. Her chest tightened. She hesitated. If she answered, she'd have to hear the concern in her mother's voice. The worry, the disappointment. She didn't want to hear. Oh, sweetheart, what happened? Or, Emma, how could you let this happen? But she also knew that if she let the call go to voicemail, she'd just be prolonging the inevitable. With a shaky breath, she swiped to answer. Mom. Oh, Emma. Her mother's voice was soft, but filled with something that made Emma's throat tighten. Relief. I've been calling and calling. I was so worried. Emma closed her eyes. I know. Honey, what happened? Her mother's voice was gentle but edged with concern. I just saw something on the news about a flight attendant getting fired on board a flight. Please tell me that's not. Emma let out a bitter laugh. Yeah, that's me. Silence. For a moment, Emma thought the call had dropped. But then her mother exhaled. Long and heavy. Oh, sweetheart. And just like that, the dam inside Emma broke. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over before she could stop them. She pressed a hand to her mouth, trying to muffle the sob that escaped. She hadn't wanted to cry, not in public, not in front of strangers, and definitely not on the phone with her mother. But hearing that one simple phrase, oh, sweetheart, not judgment, not anger, just understanding, it shattered her last bit of control. I don't know what happened. Emma choked out. I wasn't thinking. I was just so frustrated. And then I said something stupid. And now, her voice cracked. Now it's over. Mom, it's all over. Her mother didn't rush to fill the silence. She didn't offer empty reassurances like, it's not that bad, or, you'll bounce back. She just listened. When Emma's sobs finally quieted, her mother spoke again, her voice steady. Emma, I know this feels like the end of the world right now. And I won't tell you that it's nothing, because I know it means everything to you. But, honey, one mistake doesn't erase who you are. Emma sniffled, swiping at her wet cheeks. I spent years building this life, she whispered, and I lost it all in seconds. I know, her mother said, and that's not fair. But, Emma, tell me something. Did you love your job because of the uniform? Because of the airline? Emma hesitated. No. Then why? Emma swallowed, her throat sore from crying. Because I loved helping people. Because I loved meeting new faces. Making people feel comfortable. Making a difference in small ways. Her mother's voice softened. Then that part of you didn't disappear today. You are still the woman who cares. Who makes people feel safe. Who brightens a stranger's day. No company can take that away from you. Emma bit her lip, staring down at the cracks in the pavement beneath her feet. Her mother's words made sense. But right now, the only thing she could feel was failure. A soft chime broke the silence, a new message. Emma pulled her phone away from her ear for just a second. It was from Emily again. I mean it, you're not alone. When you're ready, let's meet. I'll buy the coffee. Just let me know where you are. Emma inhaled shakily. Another message popped up, this one from Nathan, a fellow flight attendant she had worked with for years. Emma, just heard. I'm so sorry. If you need to talk, I'm here. Then another. You don't deserve this. Don't let them make you think you do. Another. Emma, I know you must be feeling awful right now. But please don't disappear. We're still here for you. Emma covered her mouth with her hand, fresh tears welling up in her eyes. She had thought she was alone. But she wasn't. There were still people who cared. Who didn't see her as a failure. Who weren't writing her off as just another cautionary tale. Her mother's voice pulled her back. Emma, listen to me. You are allowed to grieve this. You are allowed to be angry. To be heartbroken. But you are not allowed to give up on yourself. Emma let out a shaky breath. I don't know what to do next. Then don't worry about next. Just worry about now. Her mother said gently. Right now. You need to breathe. You need to eat something. You need to let the people who love you be here for you. Emma nodded, even though her mother couldn't see it. For the first time since she had stepped off that plane, she felt a little lighter. She wasn't okay yet, But maybe she didn't have to be. Maybe it was enough, for now, to just keep moving forward. She pulled up Emily's message, hesitated, then typed, "I could use that coffee." The reply was instant. "Name the place. I'm already on my way." Emma closed her eyes and exhaled. One step at a time. And if you've ever felt like Emma, like you were drowning in regret, like you didn't know how to move forward, leave a comment below. Let her know she's not alone. Because no one should have to go through this alone. Emma walked through the quiet streets of the city, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as if that alone could hold her together. The crisp night air carried the distant sounds of cars and laughter from nearby bars. But she barely noticed. Everything felt distant, blurred, as if she were moving through a world she no longer belonged to. She had spent so much time trying to escape the weight of what had happened, trying to outrun the shame, the regret, the whispers of strangers who now only knew her as that flight attendant who got fired mid-flight. But no matter how far she walked, she couldn't outrun her own mind. The thought came suddenly, painfully. What if I deserved this? She had worked so hard for that job. It had become her identity, her purpose. It was the reason she woke up early, the reason she fought through exhaustion, the reason she had missed countless birthdays and holidays. And now, all of it was gone. Because of one moment. Because she let her frustration win. Emma exhaled shakily, stopping at the edge of a small park. The bench in front of her sat empty, bathed in the golden glow of a nearby street lamp. She hesitated before sinking onto it, her legs suddenly too weak to carry her any further. For the first time all night, she allowed herself to be still. She stared at her hands, the same hands that had served passengers for years, that had held safety cards during demonstrations, that had handed out meals and reassured nervous travelers. They had always known what to do. But now they just trembled uselessly in her lap. Her breath came in slow, uneven waves as she forced herself to face the truth she had been running from all night. She had made a mistake. A real, serious mistake. And no amount of self-pity, no amount of what-ifs could undo it. But, did this mistake define her? Was this truly the end of everything she had worked for? She didn't have an answer. Not yet. But for the first time since stepping off that plane, she realized she had a choice. She could let this moment destroy her. She could let herself sink into the shame, the regret, the belief that she was nothing more than a failure. Or, she could learn from it. She could take this pain, this embarrassment, this regret, and grow. Emma bit her lip, a fresh wave of emotion washing over her. Maybe she hadn't been as careful as she thought. Maybe she had let her emotions cloud her judgment. Maybe, deep down, she had stopped being the person she wanted to be. Had she let the long shifts, the exhaustion, the constant demands of the job wear her down to the point where she had lost herself? She thought back to the younger version of herself, the girl who had stepped onto her first plane as a flight attendant. Full of excitement, eager to make a difference. What would that girl think of her now? Would she be disappointed? Or would she understand? Emma inhaled deeply, the cold air stinging her lungs. Maybe this was a lesson she needed to learn. Maybe life wasn't punishing her. Maybe it was pushing her, forcing her to confront something she had ignored for too long. For years, she had defined herself by her career. But was she only her job? She had spent so much time trying to be the perfect employee. The one who followed every rule. The one who put on a brave face even when she was breaking inside. But she wasn't perfect. She was human. And humans make mistakes. Emma let out a shaky breath, wiping away a stray tear. She still didn't know what came next. She still didn't know if she would ever set foot on a plane again. But maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to have all the answers tonight. Maybe all she had to do was take one step forward. Emma pulled out her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen. Her mother's last message was still there, glowing softly against the darkness. "Come home. We'll figure this out together." She swallowed the lump in her throat. For the first time all night, she didn't feel completely alone. She tapped out a message. "I think I'm ready to talk." And when her mother replied, "I'll be waiting." "Sweetheart." Emma felt something shift inside her. The weight in her chest was still there. The fear of the unknown still lingered. But beneath it, something small, something fragile, had begun to grow. Hope. And if you've ever felt like Emma, if you've ever struggled with regret, if you've ever questioned whether you could rise after falling, leave a comment below. Because mistakes don't define us. What we do next does. The city was quiet, save for the occasional rush of a passing car. Emma walked along the empty sidewalk, her hands shoved deep into the pockets of her jacket. The air was crisp, biting at her skin, but she barely noticed. Her mind was too full. Thoughts tumbling over each other. Memories flashing like a reel of a movie she never wanted to watch again. She had replayed the moment of her firing too many times to count. The way Paul had looked at her. The whispers from the passengers. The sinking realization that her career was slipping through her fingers before she could even reach out to catch it. She had spent the last few hours drowning in shame, in regret, in the aching loneliness of knowing that her life had changed forever. But as she walked, something inside her shifted. For the first time, she stopped thinking about what she had lost, and started thinking about what she still had. She still had her family. She still had friends who cared. She still had herself. That thought alone stopped her in her tracks. Emma turned her gaze upward, staring at the city skyline, the soft glow of distant lights blinking against the darkness. For so long, her identity had been wrapped up in her job, the routine, the uniform, the constant movement. It had given her purpose, direction, a sense of belonging, and without it, she had felt empty, like a ship lost at sea with no destination. But maybe she wasn't lost. Maybe she was just at the start of a new path. She thought about the younger version of herself, the girl who had dreamed of adventure, of traveling, of making a difference in people's lives. The girl who had stepped onto her first flight as a flight attendant with wide eyes and a heart full of hope. That girl still existed. She wasn't just her mistakes. She wasn't just one bad moment. She was more. Emma took a deep breath and pulled out her phone. She hesitated for a second, then tapped open a note. She started writing, not overthinking, just letting the words flow. Things I have learned. Mistakes don't define me. One bad moment does not erase all the good I have done. I am still capable. I am still worthy. People will judge, but their opinions don't shape my future. Strangers will talk, but they will forget. I cannot live my life afraid of what others think. Losing something doesn't mean I have lost myself. My job is gone, but I am still here. I still have the power to build something new. I am allowed to start over. This is not the end. This is just a redirection. A chance to rebuild my life in a way that makes me happy. I will keep moving forward, even when it feels impossible. One step at a time. One decision at a time. I will not stay stuck in this moment. She stared at the list, her fingers hovering over the screen. Then, without hesitation, she hit save. For the first time since she had stepped off that plane, a sense of peace settled in her chest. It wasn't over. She wasn't done. She was just beginning again. A new chapter begins. The next morning, Emma sat by her window, a cup of coffee warming her hands. The night before had been long, filled with thoughts she wasn't ready to face. But this morning felt different. She still didn't have all the answers. She still didn't know exactly what came next. But she knew one thing. She wasn't going to let this moment break her. She opened her laptop, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. A quick search pulled up job listings. Flight attendant positions, of course. But also other opportunities, customer service, hospitality, travel agencies, things she had never considered before. Maybe this was a sign that she was meant to explore something new. Her heart still ached at the idea of never stepping onto a plane as a flight attendant again. But she had to believe that if she was meant to return to the skies, she would find a way. For now, she just needed to take one step. Emma started applying, one job at a time, one email at a time, one step forward. She wasn't looking back anymore. Advice from Emma's story. Lessons we can all take forward. Emma's story is more than just about losing a job. It's about what happens when life throws us into the unknown. We all have moments where we feel like everything is falling apart. Like one mistake has changed the course of our future forever. We feel ashamed, lost, and hopeless. But here's the truth. One mistake does not define you. Life is full of second chances. The only way you truly fail is if you stop trying. Seedling growth comes from challenges. The hardest moments in life are the ones that teach us the most. If Emma had never lost her job, she might have never stopped to ask herself what she truly wanted. Light bulb, your worth is not tied to one thing. You are not just your job, your status, or your mistakes. You are the sum of everything you have survived, learned, and experienced. Biceps keep moving forward, even when you don't know the destination. The first step is always the hardest. But once you take it, you'll realize you are stronger than you ever thought possible. So, if you are watching this and you have ever felt like Emma, if you have ever felt lost, broken, or unsure of what comes next, I want you to do something right now. Fire comment below. I will keep moving forward. Let Emma know that she is not alone. Let yourself know that you are not alone. Sparkling heart like this video if you believe in second chances. If you believe that no mistake should define a person. Bell subscribe to this channel to hear more stories like Emma's, stories of struggle, resilience, and finding light in the darkest moments. Because life is full of setbacks, but it is also full of comebacks. And Emma? She's just getting started.